Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the summer of 323 BCE, to a palace bedroom in Babylon, where the greatest conqueror the world had ever known lay dying of fever. He was 32 years old. He had walked from Macedonia to India. He had never lost a battle. And as his generals crowded the doorway, desperate for orders, for a plan, for some reassurance that the empire would not collapse the moment he stopped breathing, Alexander the Great turned his head toward the empty space beside him and asked for the one man who was not there. The man who had ridden beside him for 16 years. The man who had saved his life in battle, who had commanded his cavalry, who had held his secrets and his hopes and, if the historians are to be believed, his heart. Hephaestion had died 8 months earlier. Alexander had not recovered. He never would. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to love someone in a world where that love had no name, no category, no box to fit into? Have you ever wondered what it was like to stand beside the most powerful man on earth and know that history would never quite say what you were to each other? Have you ever wondered if love could survive conquest? If intimacy could withstand the weight of empire? If two boys who met as teenagers could hold on to each other across 16 years of war and glory and loss? What did they say to each other in the tent at night when the maps were rolled away? What did Alexander see in Hephaestion that no one else did? And what did it cost Hephaestion to be loved by a man the world would never stop wanting? Did they know on the day they met that they would never really leave each other? Did they know that 2,000 years later, we would still be arguing about what to call them? Let us begin at the beginning. Pella, the capital of Macedon, 356 BCE. A kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world, cold and mountainous and perpetually underestimated by the city-states to the south. Athens thought of Macedonians as half barbarians. Macedonians did not particularly care what Athens thought. They had their own language, their own gods, their own way of doing things. And in the summer of 356, the queen of Macedon, a woman named Olympias, gave birth to a son. They named him Alexander. His father was Philip II, a king who had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes and had come home with big ideas about infantry tactics and even bigger ideas about what Macedon could become. His mother was a princess from Epirus, a region to the west known for its connection to older, stranger gods. Olympias claimed descent from Achilles. She kept snakes. She practiced mystery rites that made even the Macedonian court nervous. Ancient sources disagree on whether she was brilliant or unhinged. She was probably both. Alexander grew up in a world soaked in Greek literature and Macedonian violence. His tutor, starting when Alexander was 13, was Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. The philosopher had been hired by Philip to teach the crown prince and a small group of other noble boys at a quiet estate called Mieza, away from the noise and intrigue of the capital. For 3 years, Alexander studied Homer, rhetoric, medicine, philosophy, the sciences. He learned to think, he learned to question, and he learned because Aristotle could not help himself that the world was vast and knowable and waiting to be categorized. But the text Alexander returned to again and again was the Iliad. He kept a copy under his pillow for the rest of his life. The Aristeia of Achilles, the rage and grief and impossible glory. It was the story that shaped him. And the relationship that mattered most in that story was not Achilles and Agamemnon, not Achilles and Priam. It was Achilles and Patroclus. Two men bound by something the text never quite names. Friendship. Love. A bond so total that when Patroclus died, Achilles lost the will to live. Somewhere in that group of boys studying with Aristotle was a young man named Hephaestion. We do not know exactly when they met. Ancient historians maddeningly do not bother to tell us. Hephaestion appears in the sources fully formed, already at Alexander's side, already essential. His father was a Macedonian nobleman named Amyntoros. His mother's name is lost. He was tall, taller than Alexander, which most people were. He was handsome, if the later descriptions are to be believed, though ancient writers rarely spent much time on the physical appearance of anyone who was not Alexander. He was devoted, totally, unreservedly, in a way that ancient and modern historians have spent 2,000 years trying to explain. The Greeks had a word for the kind of relationship they might have had: pederastia, the love between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger boy, the Eromenos. It was a structured, socially recognized institution in much of the Greek world, especially in Athens and Thebes. The older man was supposed to be the mentor, the younger the student. The relationship was expected to be educational, formative, temporary. It was about shaping a boy into a citizen, and it was deeply embedded in the military culture of the Greek city-states. The Theban sacred band, an elite fighting unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, was founded on the idea that men fight harder when their beloved is watching. They were undefeated for decades. Philip himself had lived in Thebes as a teenager and had seen the sacred band in action. He knew what that bond could do on a battlefield. But Alexander and Hephaestion did not fit the pattern. They were the same age, near enough. There was no clear Erastes and Eromenos. Neither was the teacher, neither the student, or perhaps they both were, to each other. Their relationship does not slot neatly into the categories the Greeks themselves used, and that is part of why the question of what they were to each other has never been settled. The ancient sources do not use the language of eros when they describe Hephaestion and Alexander. They use the language of philia, friendship, the deepest kind, a bond of souls. Plutarch, writing 4 centuries later, says explicitly that Alexander loved Hephaestion most of all his companions. He does not say how, he does not need to. The how is everywhere in what happened next. By the time Alexander was 16, his father had gone to war again, this time a campaign in the south that would take months. Philip left Alexander in charge of Macedon, not as a figurehead, as regent, with the royal seal. The boy had barely finished his studies with Aristotle, and his father handed him a kingdom and told him not to let it fall apart. Alexander did more than that. A Thracian tribe to the north saw an opportunity and revolted. Alexander raised an army, marched north, crushed the revolt, and founded a city on the site of their former capital. He named it Alexandropolis. He was 16. It is the first city that bears his name. There would be many more. 2 years later, in 338 BCE, Philip finally made his move on Greece itself. The city-states had been squabbling for decades, and Philip had been slowly, carefully building alliances and breaking enemies and positioning Macedon as the power that could unify them all. The showdown came at Cheronea, a town in Boeotia, in central Greece. Philip commanded one wing of the Macedonian army. Alexander, 18 years old, commanded the other. Across the field stood the armies of Athens and Thebes, including the sacred band, those 150 pairs of lovers who had never lost. The battle was brutal. The Macedonian phalanx, with its 18-foot sarissas, was a new kind of weapon, and the Greek hoplites had no answer for it. Alexander led a cavalry charge that broke the Theban line. The sacred band fought to the last man. They died together, in pairs, where they stood. Plutarch says that when Philip walked the battlefield afterward and saw the bodies of the sacred band lying in a heap, he wept. He knew what that bond meant. He had seen it in Thebes as a boy, and now his son had destroyed it. Hephaestion fought at Chaeronea. We do not have details. Ancient historians rarely bothered with anyone who was not a king, but he was there. He was part of Alexander's inner circle by then, one of the companions, the elite cavalry unit that surrounded the king in battle. He would have ridden beside Alexander in that charge. He would have seen the same thing Alexander saw, the moment when the Greek world realized it had lost, that the future belonged to Macedon, that everything was about to change. Philip spent the next 2 years consolidating his control over Greece. He formed the League of Corinth, a coalition of Greek city-states with himself at the head, and announced that he would lead a united Greek army east into Persia to avenge the Persian invasions of a century and a half earlier. It was a propaganda masterpiece. It was also genuine ambition. Philip wanted the Persian Empire. He had spent his entire reign preparing for it. But in 336 BCE, at a wedding feast in the old Macedonian capital of Aegae, one of Philip's own bodyguards walked up to him and stabbed him to death. The assassin was killed immediately. His motives died with him. Theories have swirled ever since. Was it a personal grudge? Was it a political conspiracy? Was Olympias involved? Was Alexander? We do not know. What we know is that Philip was dead, and Alexander, at 20 years old, was king. The Greek city-states immediately tested him. Thebes revolted. Athens hesitated. The northern tribes that Philip had spent years subduing decided a boy king was no threat. Alexander moved faster than any of them expected. He marched north, crushed the northern tribes, swung south, and appeared outside Thebes before the city had time to prepare. He offered terms. Thebes refused. Alexander took the city in a single day, sold the population into slavery, and razed Thebes to the ground. He left one building standing, the house of the poet Pindar, because Alexander loved poetry and thought some things should be sacred. The rest of Greece got the message. The boy king was not his father. He was faster, harder, and he did not bluff. By 334 BCE, Alexander was ready to do what his father had planned. He crossed into Asia with an army of roughly 40,000 men, Macedonians, Greeks, Thracians, mercenaries. Hephaestion was with him. He had been given command of the companion cavalry, one of the highest military positions in the army. This was not a ceremonial post. The companions were the hammer of Alexander's battlefield tactics. The phalanx held the line, and the companions broke it. Hephaestion was not just Alexander's friend. He was one of his best generals. Ancient sources make that clear. He was not carried along for sentiment. He earned his place. The first major battle came at the Granicus River near the coast of Asia Minor. The Persian satraps had gathered an army to stop Alexander before he could gain momentum. It was a savage, close-quarters fight in the shallows of a river, cavalry against cavalry, and Alexander nearly died in the first minutes. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates swung an axe at Alexander's head. It shattered his helmet. Alexander killed Spithridates, but another Persian, Roysax, was already swinging. The blow would have split Alexander's skull. Clytus, one of Alexander's officers, drove a spear through Roysax's chest. Alexander survived. Barely. Hephaestion was there. The sources do not give us his role in the fight, but he was part of the cavalry charge. He would have seen how close they came to losing everything in the first 20 minutes. After the Granicus, the cities of the Ionian coast opened their gates. Alexander presented himself as a liberator, freeing Greeks from Persian rule. Some cities believed it. some did not have a choice. The army moved south, through Asia Minor, gathering strength and momentum. And at every city, Alexander made sacrifices at the local temples, honored the local gods, and looked for sites connected to the heroes of the Iliad. At Troy, he and Hephaestion made a pilgrimage. Alexander laid a wreath at the tomb of Achilles. Hephaestion laid a wreath at the tomb of Patroclus. The historian Arrian, writing 5 centuries later, records this detail without comment, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the parallel is deliberate. Achilles and Patroclus, Alexander and Hephaestion. 2 pairs of companions, 2 bonds that went deeper than the language of the time could hold. Alexander was claiming the lineage. He was saying, out loud, in public, "This is what we are." Whether they were lovers in the physical sense is something ancient sources dance around. Plutarch says that Alexander was largely indifferent to physical pleasure, that he prided himself on his self-control, that he rarely drank to excess and was slower than his companions to pursue women. Curtius, another historian, says that Alexander had many favorites, but that Hephaestion held a unique place. The sources describe Hephaestion as Alexander's dearest friend, his other self, his second soul. Ancient historians had language for sexual relationships between men. They used it for other figures, other kings, other contexts. They do not quite use it here. They use something else, a language of intimacy that does not need to specify, the kind of closeness that makes the question of sex seem almost secondary. They shared a tent. They shared a command. They shared 16 years of a life that no one else could understand. In November of 333 BCE, Alexander faced the Persian king for the first time. Darius III had assembled an army somewhere north of 500,000 men. Ancient numbers are notoriously unreliable, but even conservative modern estimates put the Persian force at well over 100,000, and positioned them on a coastal plain near the town of Issus, in what is now southern Turkey. Alexander had roughly 40,000. The Battle of Issus was less a fight than a massacre. Alexander led a direct cavalry charge at Darius himself, smashing through the Persian left wing and driving straight for the royal chariot. Darius, seeing Alexander coming, seeing his bodyguards cut down, turned his chariot and fled. The Persian army, seeing their king retreat, broke. Thousands died in the rout. Darius left behind his family, his mother, his wife, his 2 daughters, his young son. They were taken to Alexander's camp as prisoners. The next morning, Alexander and Hephaestion went to visit them. Plutarch tells the story. The Persian queen mother, Sisigambis, saw the 2 young men enter the tent and immediately prostrated herself before Hephaestion, assuming he was the king, because he was taller, and carried himself with obvious authority. Someone whispered that she had made a mistake. Sisigambis, horrified, began to apologize. Alexander stopped her. He said, "You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." The line became famous in the ancient world. It shows up in multiple sources, repeated and embroidered and analyzed. He too is Alexander, not a general, not a companion, another self. The sources treat the line as evidence of Alexander's generosity, his kindness toward a frightened old woman. But it is also a claim about Hephaestion, that they were interchangeable in some fundamental way, that to honor one was to honor the other. Alexander treated the Persian royal women with extraordinary respect. He gave them their own household, their own attendants, their own income. He never forced himself on them. This startled the ancient historians who expected conquerors to take what they wanted. Darius, when he learned how his family had been treated, reportedly wept with relief and said that if he had to lose his throne to anyone, he was glad it was Alexander. Later, Alexander would marry Darius's daughter. But that was years away. For now, the army moved south into Phoenicia. At Tyre, a wealthy island city that controlled a crucial portion of Mediterranean trade, Alexander demanded submission. Tyre refused. The city sat half a mile offshore, surrounded by walls 150 feet high, and had never been taken by force. Alexander built a causeway. He spent 7 months filling in the ocean, building a land bridge out to the island, hauling stones and timber and rubble, while the Tyrians shot arrows and dropped boulders and set fire to the siege engines. Hephaestion commanded part of the engineering effort. It was grinding, tedious, brutal work. Men drowned, men burned. The causeway collapsed twice. They rebuilt it. In the summer of 332 BCE, Alexander's siege engines finally reached the walls. The city fell. Alexander sold 30,000 Tyrians into slavery and crucified 2,000 more as a lesson to anyone else thinking of resisting. It was not mercy, it was empire. The causeway is still there, by the way. 23 centuries later, Tyre is no longer an island. The causeway became permanent, and the sea filled in around it. Alexander changed the shape of the coastline. Egypt welcomed him. After centuries of Persian rule, the Egyptians were happy to see anyone who was not Darius. Alexander was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, and he made the long journey west across the desert to the oracle of Amun at Siwa. What the oracle told him, he never said. Ancient sources claim he was told he was the son of Zeus, or the son of Amun, or destined to rule the world. Alexander let the rumors spread. He did not contradict them. When he emerged from the temple, he began planning a city at the mouth of the Nile. He paced out the dimensions himself, marking the streets with barley flour, because they had no chalk. The city was called Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the Library of Alexandria, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, a center of learning and trade and culture that would outlast the empire by centuries. Alexander founded more than 20 cities named after himself. This one mattered most. By 331 BCE, Darius had assembled another army. This one was even larger than the last, gathered on a plain near the town of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. Darius had chosen the ground carefully, flat, open terrain perfect for his chariots and his numerical advantage. Ancient sources claim he had 1 million men. Modern historians estimate closer to 100,000, maybe more. Alexander had roughly 50,000. The night before the battle, Hephaestion and the other generals urged Alexander to attack under cover of darkness, to use surprise to offset the Persian numbers. Alexander refused. He said he would not steal his victory. Plutarch records the exchange. It sounds arrogant. It probably was. But Alexander also knew that his men needed to see the Persians break in daylight, needed to witness the impossible made real, or they would never believe the empire could fall. The Battle of Gaugamela was fought on October 1st, 331 BCE. It was the largest set-piece battle of Alexander's life. Darius had scythed chariots, war machines with blades attached to the wheels, designed to cut through infantry lines and cause panic. He had war elephants. He had cavalry from 12 different provinces. He had every advantage except one. Alexander moved faster than anyone expected. He led the companion cavalry in a diagonal charge across the field, aiming not for the center of the Persian line, but for a seam, a gap that opened when Darius tried to outflank the Macedonian left. Hephaestion commanded part of that charge. The companions punched through the Persian line and drove again directly toward Darius. And again, Darius fled. His chariot disappeared into the dust, and the Persian army, seeing their king abandon them for the second time, broke. The rout was total. Darius did not stop running until he reached the mountains of Media, hundreds of miles to the east. Alexander took Babylon without a fight. The city opened its gates, and Alexander entered in triumph, sacrificing to the Babylonian god Marduk and presenting himself as the legitimate successor to the ancient kings of Mesopotamia. He took Susa, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire, where the royal treasury held 40,000 talents of silver and gold. 40,000. To put that in perspective, the entire Athenian Empire at its height had an annual revenue of roughly 1,000 talents. Alexander had just captured enough wealth to fund his army for a decade. He took Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, where the treasury held another 120,000 talents. And then, in an act that ancient and modern historians still argue about, he burned the palace to the ground. Some sources say it was deliberate, an act of vengeance for the Persian sack of Athens a century and a half earlier. Some say it was an accident, a drunken party that got out of hand. Plutarch offers both versions and admits he does not know which is true. What we know is that the great palace of Xerxes, with its towering columns and intricate carvings and centuries of imperial memory, burned for days. The ruins are still there, in southern Iran. You can still see the scorch marks on the stone. Darius fled east, into Bactria, the farthest edge of the empire. Alexander followed. He did not have a choice. As long as Darius was alive, the war was not over. As long as Darius could claim the throne, the Persian nobility had someone to rally around. The chase lasted months. Darius moved faster than his army could sustain, abandoning supply lines, abandoning cities, abandoning everything that might slow him down. Alexander moved faster. In the summer of 330 BCE, Alexander's advanced scouts found Darius's body on the side of a road in a village called Hecatompylos. He had been stabbed by his own men, satraps who decided a live Darius was a liability, and a dead Darius might buy them mercy from Alexander. It did not. Alexander hunted them down. But first, he gave Darius a royal funeral. He sent the body back to Persepolis and had it buried with full honours in the tombs of the Persian kings. Alexander was king of Persia now. He had to act like one. This is where the story begins to shift. For the next 7 years, Alexander was no longer fighting the Persian Empire. He was fighting to hold it together. The eastern provinces, Bactria, Sogdiana, the regions that are now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, had never been fully controlled by the Persian kings, and they were not about to submit to a Macedonian. The fighting became guerrilla war. Ambushes in mountain passes, sieges of fortresses built into cliffs, a grinding campaign against an enemy that would not meet him in open battle and would not surrender. Hephaestion was with him for all of it. He commanded half the army on several occasions, leading independent columns through territories so remote that the Greek geographers did not have names for them. He negotiated with local chiefs. He supervised the founding of new cities, garrison towns meant to hold the region after Alexander moved on. He was not just a general anymore. He was operating as a viceroy, a partner in the project of building something that could last. And Alexander was changing. The man who had crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, the young king who slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow and dreamed of being Achilles, was becoming something else. He adopted Persian dress. Not all the time, and not the full ceremonial robes, but a hybrid style. Macedonian tunic, Persian cloak, a diadem that looked more like a Persian crown than anything a Greek king would wear. He began to expect proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing or prostrating oneself before the king. To the Persians, this was normal court etiquette. To the Macedonians and Greeks, it was blasphemy. You bowed to gods, not men. The tension split the court. Some of Alexander's companions adapted, others refused. Hephaestion adapted. He wore Persian dress when the situation required it. He bowed when Alexander entered the room, at least in front of Persian nobles. Whether he did it in private, we do not know. But in public, he supported Alexander's transformation into a Persian-style king. It cost him. The other Macedonian commanders resented it. They saw Hephaestion as complicit in Alexander's drift away from his roots, away from the Macedonian identity that had built the army in the first place. In 328 BCE, the tension exploded. There was a feast at Maracanda, a city in Sogdiana, and Alexander drank too much. He had been drinking more in recent years. The sources all note it. Wine was part of Macedonian culture, but Alexander's drinking had become heavier, darker, less about celebration and more about numbing something. At the feast, an argument broke out. One of Alexander's oldest companions, a man named Clitus, the same Clitus who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River, began mocking Alexander for adopting Persian customs, for claiming descent from Zeus, for forgetting that he was Macedonian. The argument escalated. Clitus reminded Alexander that everything he had accomplished was built on his father's work, that Philip had made Macedon great, that Alexander was standing on someone else's foundation. It was the one thing you did not say to Alexander. He grabbed a spear from one of the guards and ran Clitus through. Clitus died on the floor of the banquet hall. Alexander, when the wine wore off and he realized what he had done, collapsed. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days. He refused food. He refused to see anyone. Hephaestion finally convinced him to come out. The sources do not tell us what Hephaestion said. They only tell us that Alexander emerged, held a funeral for Clitus, and never spoke of it again. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana dragged on. In 327 BCE, Alexander took a wife. Her name was Roxana. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, and the marriage was a political alliance meant to solidify Alexander's control over the region. Ancient sources describe her as beautiful, though they describe most royal women as beautiful, so we should take that with skepticism. What matters is that the marriage was strategic. Alexander needed the local nobility on his side, and marrying into one of the most powerful families in Bactria was a clear signal that he intended to stay, that he was not just a conqueror passing through, but a king building a kingdom. Roxana would eventually bear Alexander's only legitimate son, though not for several more years, and not in time for it to matter. Whether Alexander loved her, the sources do not say. Whether she loved him, they do not bother to ask. Hephaestion's role in all this is harder to pin down. The sources do not tell us how he felt about Roxana. They do not tell us if the marriage changed anything between him and Alexander. What we know is that Hephaestion remained at Alexander's side, that his position in the command structure did not shift, that Alexander continued to trust him above everyone else. The historian Arrian says explicitly that Hephaestion had more influence over Alexander than anyone, that Alexander listened to him in ways he did not listen to the other commanders. Some of that was personal. Some of it was political. Hephaestion understood what Alexander was trying to build, a kingdom that fused Macedonian and Persian, that could hold together the largest empire the world had ever seen, not through conquest alone, but through integration, through marriage alliances and shared governance, and a new kind of identity that transcended the old ethnic boundaries. Most of the Macedonians hated the idea. They wanted to loot Persia and go home. Hephaestion supported it. That made him essential. It also made him a target. In 327 BCE, a plot to assassinate Alexander was discovered. It involved several of the royal pages, young noblemen who served in Alexander's household as part of their training. The ringleader was a boy named Hermolaos, who had been publicly humiliated by Alexander during a hunt, and had decided that the only solution was murder. The plot was betrayed before it could be carried out, and the pages were arrested, tried, and executed. But the interrogation revealed something else. Hermolaos claimed that he had been encouraged by Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had been traveling with the army as the official historian of the campaign. Callisthenes had been openly critical of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, openly mocking the proskynesis, openly questioning whether Alexander was still the student Aristotle had taught or had become something alien and dangerous. Whether Callisthenes was actually involved in the plot, we do not know. Alexander decided he was. Callisthenes was arrested and died in custody. Some sources say he was executed. Some say he died of illness. Either way, the message was clear. Criticism of the king was no longer safe, even for intellectuals, even for men connected to Aristotle himself. By late 327 BCE, Alexander had secured the eastern provinces enough to move on. The next target was India. Not the whole subcontinent. Alexander did not have a clear sense of how large India was, but the northwestern regions, the lands beyond the Indus River that had once paid tribute to the Persian kings, and might, Alexander thought, pay tribute to him. The army crossed the Hindu Kush in the spring of 326 BCE, marching through snowstorms and thin air and terrain so hostile that men and horses died of cold and exhaustion before they ever saw a battlefield. They descended into the Indus Valley and began the slow work of subduing the local kingdoms. Some submitted without a fight, some resisted. At a fortress called Aornos, built on a rock outcropping so steep that local legend said even Heracles had failed to take it, Alexander spent weeks organizing a siege, building ramps and bridges and hauling siege equipment up a mountainside until the defenders, seeing that resistance was impossible, surrendered. Alexander left a garrison and moved on. The largest battle in India came at the Hydaspes River in May of 326 BCE. A local king named Porus had assembled an army to stop Alexander from crossing. Porus had war elephants, dozens of them, massive creatures that terrified the Macedonian horses and could shatter an infantry line just by walking through it. The Hydaspes was in flood, swollen with monsoon rains, and Porus positioned his army on the far bank, daring Alexander to try to cross. Alexander spent days fainting, moving his cavalry up and down the riverbank as if preparing to ford, keeping Porus's attention divided. Then, one night, he took a small force 20 miles upriver, crossed in the dark, and marched back down to hit Porus from the side. The battle was chaos. The elephants caused havoc, trampling men and horses, panicking the Macedonian lines. But the phalanx held, and the companions, led by Alexander and Hephaestion, drove through the Indian cavalry and surrounded the elephants, cutting them off from support. Porus fought from the back of the largest elephant, refusing to retreat even as his army collapsed around him. When he was finally captured, wounded and exhausted, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus said, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed, restored him to his throne as a vassal and left him to govern his own lands. It was the kind of gesture Alexander loved, magnanimous, theatrical, and strategically sound. A loyal vassal was worth more than a sullen province, but the army had had enough. They had been marching for 8 years. They had crossed deserts and mountains and rivers. They had fought in climates they did not understand, against enemies they had never heard of, for a king who showed no sign of stopping. At a place called the Hephaestion River, the easternmost point of Alexander's campaign, the army mutinied. Not violently. They simply refused to go farther. Alexander called an assembly and gave a speech. Arrian preserves it, though certainly not word for word. Alexander reminded them of everything they had accomplished, of the empire they had built, of the wealth they had taken, of the glory that would follow them for the rest of history. He told them that India was almost won, that just a little farther east lay the edge of the world, the great ocean that the Greeks believed encircled the earth, and that if they turned back now, they would never know what they had missed. The army did not care. They wanted to go home. Alexander retreated to his tent and refused to see anyone for 3 days. It was Hephaestion again, who finally convinced him to accept reality. The sources do not give details, but Alexander emerged, agreed to turn back, and ordered 12 massive altars built on the bank of the Hephaestion as a monument to the farthest point of his march. The altars are long gone. But Alexander never forgave the mutiny. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove he had not needed them, that he could have gone farther, that the only thing that stopped him was their weakness, not his. The return journey was worse than the advance. Alexander decided to march back through the Gedrosian Desert, a barren wasteland in what is now southern Pakistan and southeastern Iran, because no army had ever successfully crossed it, and Alexander wanted to be the first. It was a catastrophe. The army ran out of water. The supply wagons sank in the sand. Men died of thirst, of heat stroke, of exhaustion. Flash floods swept through the camps at night, drowning soldiers in their sleep. Ancient sources claim that Alexander lost more men crossing the Gedrosian desert than he lost in all his battles combined. Modern historians think that is an exaggeration, but not by much. Hephaestion led part of the column on a parallel route, closer to the coast, with slightly better access to water. His men fared better. But the crossing broke something in the army. The invincible force that had marched out of Macedon in 334 BCE limped into Persia in 325 BCE, exhausted, traumatized, and furious. Alexander did not slow down. He purged the provincial governors who had assumed he was never coming back and had started acting like independent kings. He executed some. He exiled others. He married again, this time in a mass ceremony at Susa, where he and 90 of his officers took Persian wives in a single day. Alexander married Statira, the daughter of Darius, cementing his claim to the Persian throne. Hephaestion married her sister, Drypetis. It was theatre. It was policy. It was Alexander's vision of a fused Greco-Persian ruling class made literal. The Macedonian soldiers hated it. They saw it as a betrayal, as proof that Alexander cared more about his Persian subjects than about the men who had bled for him. A few months later, at the city of Opis on the Tigris River, the army mutinied again. This time it was violent. Alexander had announced that he was releasing the older Macedonian veterans and sending them home with generous bonuses, and the soldiers, instead of being grateful, rioted. They accused him of replacing them with Persians, of building a new army that did not need them, of forgetting where he came from. Alexander lost his temper. He leapt off the platform, grabbed 13 of the ringleaders with his own hands, and ordered them executed on the spot. Then he locked himself in his quarters and refused to see anyone. For 2 days, the Macedonians waited outside, unsure whether they were about to be purged or forgiven. On the 3rd day, Alexander emerged and announced a reconciliation feast. 9,000 men attended. Alexander sacrificed to the gods and prayed for harmony between Macedonians and Persians, for a partnership in ruling the empire. The ancient sources treat it as a turning point, the moment when Alexander's vision became explicit. Whether the soldiers believed it or simply accepted that they had no other option is unclear. Through all of this, Hephaestion was there. He had been given the title of Chiliarch, a Persian court position roughly equivalent to Grand Vizier, second in command of the entire empire. No other Macedonian held a rank that high. It made Hephaestion the most powerful man in Alexander's court after Alexander himself. It also made him the lightning rod for every grievance, every resentment, every suspicion that Alexander was abandoning Macedon for Persia. The other generals despised him. Craterus, one of Alexander's most senior commanders, openly hated him. The two men had clashed repeatedly, and on at least one occasion had nearly come to blows before Alexander intervened. Eumenes, another senior officer, managed a working relationship with Hephaestion but kept his distance. The sources describe Hephaestion as arrogant, quick to anger, unwilling to tolerate criticism. They also describe him as loyal, capable, and utterly devoted to Alexander. Both were probably true. He had spent 16 years as the second most important person in Alexander's life, and he knew it, and he did not pretend otherwise. In the autumn of 324 BCE, the court moved to Ecbatana, a city in the Zagros Mountains that served as a summer capital for the Persian kings. Alexander was planning another campaign, this time into Arabia, but first there were games and festivals to celebrate the successful conclusion of the Indian campaign and the integration of the empire. Hephaestion participated in the athletic contests. He had always been athletic, tall, strong, a capable horseman and soldier. But at some point during the games, he fell ill. The sources describe it as a fever. Fevers were common. Most people recovered. Hephaestion did not. His condition worsened over the course of a week. Alexander stayed by his side. The royal physician, a Greek named Glaucias, tried everything. Bloodletting, purgatives, rest, diet changes. Nothing worked. On the 7th day, Alexander left the room briefly to attend a sacrifice or a meeting. The sources disagree on the reason, and while he was gone, Hephaestion ate a meal against the physician's orders. A roasted chicken and a flagon of wine. His fever spiked. By the time Alexander returned, Hephaestion was dying. He died in October of 324 BCE. He was 32 years old, the same age Alexander would be when he died 8 months later. Alexander's grief was total, immediate, uncontrollable. The sources all agree on this, even the ones written centuries later by historians who had no love for Alexander and no reason to exaggerate. Plutarch says Alexander threw himself on the body and lay there for hours, refusing to move, refusing to eat, refusing to acknowledge anyone who tried to pull him away. Arrian says he ordered the royal physician executed for incompetence, though some sources suggest Glaucius fled before the sentence could be carried out. Diodorus says Alexander cut his hair in mourning, a gesture borrowed from Achilles, who had done the same when Patroclus died. He ordered the manes and tails of all the horses in the camp cut as well. He ordered the battlements of every city in the empire torn down, so that the cities themselves would appear to be in mourning. He sent messengers to the oracle of Ammon in Egypt, the same oracle that had proclaimed him son of Zeus years earlier, asking whether Hephaestion should be honored as a hero or worshipped as a god. The oracle, diplomatically, suggested hero. Alexander ordered monuments built, temples, a funeral pyre that would cost 10,000 talents to construct. 10,000 talents. That was a quarter of the wealth Alexander had seized from Persepolis. It was more than most cities spent on public works in a decade. The pyre was designed by an architect named Stachycrates, the same man who had proposed carving Mount Athos into a statue of Alexander, holding a city in one hand and a river in the other. Alexander had turned down that proposal as too expensive. He did not turn this one down. The pyre was built in Babylon, where Alexander was headed next, and it was designed to be the largest funeral monument the world had ever seen. 200 feet tall, multi-tiered, covered in gold and purple fabric, decorated with statues and carvings, and the prows of ships. At the base were golden lions. Above that, torches held by golden eagles. Above that, friezes showing battle scenes, hunting scenes, images of centaurs and other mythological creatures. At the very top, a pavilion where Hephaestion's body would rest before being consummated by fire. Ancient sources describe it in awed, bewildered detail. They could not quite believe anyone would spend that much on a funeral. Even for a king, it was excessive. Hephaestion was not a king. He was a companion, a general, a chiliarch. He was Alexander's beloved, and Alexander, in his grief, was trying to remake the world into something that could hold the size of what he had lost. He postponed the Arabian campaign. He postponed everything. For weeks, he did nothing but plan the funeral and organize the games that would accompany it. Athletic contests, musical performances, dramatic productions, 3,000 performers brought in from across the empire. It was not a funeral. It was a festival of grief, a public declaration that the world had changed and everyone needed to acknowledge it. The ancient sources, particularly the Roman-era historians, treat Alexander's mourning as evidence of weakness, as proof that his emotions had overwhelmed his judgment, that he had become unfit to rule. They compare him unfavorably to leaders who buried their loved ones quietly and returned to work. But the Greek sources, particularly Arrian, treat it differently. Arrian describes the grief as understandable, even appropriate. He reminds his readers of Achilles, who refused to fight after Patroclus died, who built a massive pyre and sacrificed horses and dogs and 12 Trojan captives on the flames, who spent days weeping over the ashes. Alexander was not pretending to be Achilles. He was living the story he had carried with him since childhood, the story that had shaped everything he understood about love and loss and glory. While the pyre was being built, Alexander launched a campaign. Not the Arabian campaign he had planned, but a punitive expedition into the mountains north of Ecbatana against a tribe called the Cossayans. The Kossaians had been raiding Persian territory for years, and the Persian kings had generally left them alone because the terrain was too difficult and the reward too small. Alexander did not care about reward. He needed something to kill. The campaign lasted weeks. It was brutal, methodical, and pointless. The Kossaians were not a military threat. They were shepherds and bandits. Alexander's army swept through their territory, burning villages, killing anyone who resisted, enslaving anyone who surrendered. Ancient sources describe it as a sacrifice to Hephaestion's spirit, as if the death of an entire tribe could somehow balance the scale. It could not, but it gave Alexander something to do with his hands, something to focus on that was not the empty space beside him. By the time he returned to Babylon in the spring of 323 BCE, the pyre was ready. The funeral was held in May. The body had been preserved for months, embalmed in honey and spices, waiting for Alexander to finish his grieving, and his killing, and his preparation. The games were held first, days of athletic contests and performances. Then the body was placed on the pyre, and Alexander lit the fire himself. The flames burned for days. The smoke could be seen for miles. When the pyre finally collapsed, Alexander collected the ashes and placed them in a golden urn. He ordered a tomb built in Babylon, though some sources suggest he planned to move the remains later to a more permanent monument in Alexandria or somewhere else that could hold the scale of what Hephaestion had meant to him. The tomb was never finished. 8 months later, Alexander would be dead, and the ashes, like so much else, would be lost in the chaos that followed. The embassies started arriving in Babylon that summer. Delegations from across the known world, from Libya and Ethiopia and the cities of Italy, from Carthage and the Celtic tribes of Gaul, all coming to pay respects to the man who had conquered the Persian Empire and now sat at the center of the world, deciding what came next. They brought gifts, they brought treaties, they brought requests for trade agreements and military alliances and adjudication of local disputes. Alexander received them all. He listened to their concerns. He gave orders, issued decrees, made promises. But the sources all note that something had changed. He drank more. He was quicker to anger. He made decisions that seemed erratic, impulsive, disconnected from the careful strategy that had built the empire. He announced plans to conquer Arabia, then changed his mind and said he would invade Carthage, then changed his mind again and said he would march west into Italy and then north into Europe until he reached the Atlantic. The generals stopped taking the plans seriously. They nodded and agreed and assumed he would change his mind again. He issued an edict ordering all the Greek cities to recall their exiles and restore their property. It sounds reasonable on the surface, even generous, but it was a political disaster. The Greek cities had been exiling people for centuries, usually as part of internal political struggles, and the exiles had resettled elsewhere, and their property had been redistributed, and entire local economies had been built around the assumption that those people were never coming back. Forcing the cities to reverse all of that would destabilize governments, provoke riots, and create a wave of refugees with no place to go. The cities protested. Alexander did not care. He issued another edict, this one even stranger. He wanted the Greek cities to worship him as a god, not as a hero, not as a descendant of Zeus, but as an actual living god entitled to temples and sacrifices and cult worship. Some cities complied immediately, either because they believed it or because they were afraid not to. Athens debated. Sparta sent back a one-line response that became famous in the ancient world. If Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be a god. Dry, dismissive, perfectly Spartan. Alexander did not punish them. He had bigger things on his mind. In early June of 323 BCE, Alexander attended a dinner party hosted by one of his companions, a Thessalian named Medius. The sources describe it as a long night, heavy drinking, the kind of Macedonian symposium that could go until dawn. Alexander drank. He had been drinking heavily since Hephaestion's death, more than usual. and his usual was already significant. At some point during the night, he started to feel ill. A fever, chills, nausea. He left the party early and went to bed. The next day, he felt worse. He pushed through it. He had sacrifices to perform, meetings to attend, orders to give. He bathed, hoping the fever would break. It did not. By the third day, he could not get out of bed. By the fifth day, he could not speak clearly. The fever climbed. His generals gathered outside his room, waiting for orders that did not come, waiting for some sign that he would recover, that the empire would hold together, that the man who had never lost a battle would find a way to win this one. He did not. On June 10th or 11th, the sources disagree on the exact date, Alexander the Great died in a palace bedroom in Babylon. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for 12 years and conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia, covering roughly 2 million square miles and ruling over tens of millions of people. He left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child had not been born. His half-brother Aridaeus was alive, but mentally unfit to rule. His generals, the men who had spent 16 years following him across the known world, stood in the hallway outside his room and realized that everything was about to fall apart. The question of what killed Alexander has never been settled. Ancient sources offer a dozen theories. Some say it was poison, slipped into his wine by conspirators who feared his growing megalomania and wanted to stop him before he dragged the empire into another decade of pointless war. Some say it was malaria, common in the marshlands around Babylon. Some say it was typhoid fever, or some other waterborne illness picked up from the canals and irrigation systems that made Babylon livable, but also made it a breeding ground for disease. Some say it was liver failure, the result of years of heavy drinking finally catching up with him. Modern historians have analysed the symptom progression described in the ancient sources and have proposed everything from West Nile virus to pancreatitis to acute alcohol poisoning. We do not know. What we know is that he died, and the empire died with him. But before we get to the collapse, before we talk about the wars of the successors and the fracturing of everything Alexander had built, we need to talk about what his death meant in the context of the relationship that defined his life. Because the ancient sources, when they describe Alexander's final days, mention something that modern histories often skip over. Alexander asked for Hephaestion, multiple times, according to Plutarch. As the fever climbed and his mind drifted in and out of clarity, he called out for the man who had been beside him for 16 years, the man who had shared his tent and his command, and his impossible dream of remaking the world. Hephaestion had been dead for 8 months. Alexander, in his delirium, either forgot or refused to accept it. His generals did not know what to say. They stood by his bed and watched him ask for someone who could not come, and they understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of what Alexander had lost. When Alexander could no longer speak, his soldiers demanded to see him. Thousands of them, the Macedonian infantry who had followed him since the beginning, lined up outside the palace and filed through his bedroom one by one. They wanted to see for themselves that he was still alive, that the rumors were not true, that the king who had never been defeated would somehow survive this too. Alexander could not speak, but he raised his hand to each man as they passed. A gesture of recognition, a farewell. It took hours. By the time the last soldier left, Alexander was unconscious. He died that night or the next morning. The sources again disagree. His body was embalmed, like Hephaestion's had been, preserved in honey and spices while the generals argued about what to do with it. The original plan was to send it back to Macedon, to be buried in the royal tombs at Aegae beside his father. But Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who had claimed Egypt as his share of the empire, intercepted the funeral cortege and brought the body to Alexandria instead. Alexander was buried there, in the city he had founded, in a tomb that became a pilgrimage site for centuries. Roman emperors visited it. Julius Caesar stood before the sarcophagus and wept, reportedly saying that Alexander had conquered the world by the age at which Caesar had accomplished nothing. Augustus visited and accidentally broke off a piece of the mummified nose. Caligula stole the breastplate from the tomb and wore it around Rome. The tomb was still visible in the 4th century CE. Then it vanished. Earthquakes, riots, the shifting geography of Alexandria. No one knows exactly when or how it was lost. Modern archaeologists have been searching for it for 200 years. It has never been found. Hephaestion's ashes were supposed to travel with Alexander's body, to be buried together in some grand monument that would honor them both. That never happened. The tomb in Babylon was left unfinished. The ashes disappeared, probably looted or discarded during the chaos of the successor wars. There is no grave for Hephaestion, no monument that survived. The pyre that cost 10,000 talents burned for a few days and then was gone, and the man it honored became a footnote in histories written by people who never understood what he had been to Alexander. But the ancient sources, even the ones that treat Alexander harshly, even the ones that criticize his drinking and his temper and his megalomania, all agree on one thing. Hephaestion mattered, not just as a general, though he was a capable one, not just as a political operator, though he played that role when needed. He mattered because Alexander loved him in a way that he loved no one else, in a way that shaped every decision Alexander made in the last year of his life, in a way that the sources could not quite categorize or explain, but also could not ignore. The Greeks had words for different kinds of love: eros, sexual desire; philia, friendship; storge, familial affection; agape, unconditional love. The sources use philia when they talk about Hephaestion and Alexander, the deepest kind of friendship, the bond between companions who have shared everything, who trust each other completely, who would die for each other without hesitation. But philia does not quite cover it, because the sources also describe a kind of exclusivity, a possessiveness, a jealousy on Alexander's part that went beyond what friendship usually entails. When other men got too close to Hephaestion, Alexander noticed. When Hephaestion argued with Craterus or Eumenes, Alexander took Hephaestion's side, even when Hephaestion was wrong. When Hephaestion died, Alexander did not just mourn a friend. He mourned the other half of himself, the person who made him comprehensible to himself, the only person who had been there from the beginning and understood the whole arc of what Alexander had tried to do. Modern historians have debated for decades whether Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers in the physical sense. Some say yes, pointing to the parallels with Achilles and Patroclus, the intimacy of sharing a tent for 16 years, the intensity of Alexander's grief, the public gestures at Troy where Alexander claimed Achilles and Hephaestion claimed Patroclus. Some say no, pointing to the lack of explicit sexual language in the sources. The fact that ancient historians were perfectly willing to describe sexual relationships when they happened and chose not to here. The possibility that the bond was romantic, but not physical, or physical, but not romantic, or some third thing that does not map neatly onto modern categories. Some say it does not matter, that the question itself is anachronistic, that the Greeks did not divide relationships into sexual and non-sexual the way we do, that a bond could be erotically charged and life-defining without necessarily involving sex, and that asking whether they slept together misses the point. Here is what we know. Alexander loved Hephaestion. The sources all say so. The depth and exclusivity and intensity of that love went beyond what the word friendship usually contains. Whether it was sexual, whether it was romantic in the way we use that term, whether it fits into the categories we use to describe relationships today, those are questions the sources do not answer because the sources did not ask them. What the sources tell us is that Alexander trusted Hephaestion more than anyone, that he gave Hephaestion more power than anyone, that when Hephaestion died, Alexander's world collapsed in a way that it had not collapsed when his father was murdered, or his mother executed political enemies, or his wife gave birth, or any of the other major events of his life. Hephaestion's death was the thing Alexander could not survive. He lived for 8 more months, but the sources all suggest he was already gone, that the man who died in Babylon in June of 323 BCE was not the man who had crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, not because of age or war or the weight of empire, but because the person who had made him whole was gone. The later tradition, the centuries of art and literature and retellings that came after, sometimes remembered this, sometimes did not. Renaissance paintings of Alexander almost never include Hephaestion. Enlightenment histories mention him in passing, as a loyal general, nothing more. Victorian biographies, written in an era obsessed with propriety and deeply uncomfortable with same-sex intimacy, go out of their way to insist that Alexander and Hephaestion were just friends, that any suggestion otherwise is slander, that the bond was noble and pure and entirely platonic. 20th century historians began to push back, to take seriously the possibility that the relationship was more, to read the sources with an understanding that ancient sexuality worked differently than modern sexuality, and that a relationship could be central and defining without fitting into the boxes we expect. 21st century historians, particularly those working in queer history, have argued that the question of whether Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers is less interesting than the question of what their bond tells us about how the ancient world understood intimacy, loyalty, love, and power. Because here is the thing. Even if Alexander and Hephaestion never touched each other, even if the relationship was entirely non-sexual, it was still queer. Not in the sense of sexual orientation, though it may have been that too, but in the sense of refusing the categories the world offered. They were not just king and general. They were not just friends. They were not brothers, not lovers in the way the Greeks use that term, not Erastes and Eromenos, not husband and wife. They were something the language did not have a word for, something that existed in the space between all the available options, something that made the people around them uncomfortable because it did not fit, and they could not control it, and they could not predict it. Alexander made Hephaestion the second most powerful person in the empire, and when people asked why, the only answer was because Alexander wanted to. Because Hephaestion mattered to him in a way that transcended logic or strategy, or the normal operations of power. That is queer. That refusal to justify, that insistence on a bond that does not explain itself, that willingness to let the world be confused rather than fit into the roles it expected. And the world was confused. Curtius resented Hephaestion because he could not understand why Alexander trusted him so much. Eumenes kept his distance because he knew that getting between Alexander and Hephaestion was dangerous. The Persian nobles accepted Hephaestion as chiliarch because they understood the role, but they never quite understood why this particular Macedonian held it when there were older, more experienced, more politically connected men available. The Macedonian soldiers grumbled that Hephaestion was arrogant, that he had too much influence, that he encouraged Alexander's worst impulses. All of that was probably true, but it was also beside the point. Alexander did not choose Hephaestion because he was the best general, or the smartest advisor, or the most politically useful companion. He chose Hephaestion because Hephaestion was Hephaestion, because they had known each other since they were boys, because 16 years of shared experience had built something that could not be replicated or replaced. When you try to reconstruct what Hephaestion actually did, day to day, across those 16 years, the sources give you fragments. A command here, a diplomatic mission there, a moment of conflict or loyalty or decision. He commanded the companion cavalry at Gaugamela. He led an independent column through Bactria. He supervised the construction of a fleet on the Hydaspes River after the battle with Porus, overseeing the building of hundreds of ships that would carry part of the army down the Indus to the sea. He negotiated with local rulers. He enforced Alexander's orders when other commanders hesitated. He was one of the 7 bodyguards, the Somatophylakes, the men who had the right to enter Alexander's presence armed and unannounced. That was not an honorary position. It meant Alexander trusted him with his life, literally. In a court where assassination was always a possibility and paranoia was a survival skill. But the sources spend more time on the conflicts than the competence. Hephaestion and Curtius hated each other. The ancient historians mention it repeatedly, as if the rivalry was so well known that it needed no explanation. Curtius was older, more experienced, a brilliant tactical commander who had been with Alexander since the beginning. He was also deeply conservative, loyal to Macedonian traditions, suspicious of Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs, and resentful of anyone who encouraged that transformation. Hephaestion, by contrast, supported everything Alexander did. He wore Persian dress. He participated in proskynesis. He married a Persian noblewoman at Susa. He became Chiliarch, a Persian title that had no Macedonian equivalent. To Curtius, Hephaestion was a sycophant, a man who had risen beyond his abilities by flattering the king and enabling his worst impulses. To Hephaestion, Curtius was a relic, a man stuck in the past, unable to see that the empire Alexander was building required something new, something that went beyond the ethnic boundaries of Macedon and Greece. Plutarch tells a story about the two of them nearly coming to blows during a campaign. The details are vague, some argument over strategy or precedence or authority. They drew swords, their men took sides. The whole thing was about to turn into a brawl when Alexander intervened. He dressed them both down publicly, told Curtius he was a fool if he thought opposing Hephaestion would do anything but lose him Alexander's friendship, told Hephaestion he was a fool if he thought his position gave him the right to antagonize the other commanders. Then, privately, Alexander apparently told Hephaestion that he loved him more than anyone, but that he needed to stop making enemies, that the empire could not function if the command structure was at war with itself, that loyalty to Alexander meant working with people you hated for the sake of something larger. Whether Hephaestion took the advice, the sources do not say. The rivalry with Curtius continued until Hephaestion died. Eumenes, another senior commander, had a different relationship with Hephaestion. They were not friends, but they were not enemies either. Eumenes was Greek, not Macedonian, which already put him at a disadvantage in a court dominated by Macedonian nobles. He had risen through the ranks as a secretary, an administrator, someone who managed the logistics and paperwork that made the army function. He was brilliant at it. Alexander trusted him with increasingly important tasks, governing provinces, managing supply lines, commanding troops when needed. But Eumenes was always aware that he was an outsider, that the Macedonian commanders saw him as a clerk who had gotten above himself. Hephaestion, for whatever reason, did not treat him that way. The sources suggest they worked together reasonably well, that Hephaestion respected Eumenes' competence even if they were not close. After both Alexander and Hephaestion were dead, Eumenes would become one of the most effective generals in the wars of the successors, leading armies and winning battles against men who had spent their whole lives training for command. Maybe Hephaestion saw that potential. Maybe he just needed someone in the command structure who was not actively trying to undermine him. The sources also mention Hephaestion's temper. He was quick to anger, prone to taking offense, willing to hold grudges. There is a story, preserved in Plutarch, about a musician named Aristonicus who had offended Hephaestion in some minor way. The details are lost, and Hephaestion refused to speak to him for months, even though Aristonicus was part of Alexander's household, and the two men had to see each other regularly. It is a small story, barely worth recording, but it tells you something about how Hephaestion operated. He did not forget slights. He did not let things go. In a court where everyone was jockeying for position and favor, that made him dangerous. It also made him effective. People knew that crossing Hephaestion meant crossing Alexander, and most of them were not willing to take that risk. What the sources do not tell us, because they were not interested in it, is what Hephaestion thought about any of this. We have no letters from him, no speeches, no private writings. Everything we know about him comes filtered through other people's accounts, and those accounts are focused on Alexander. Hephaestion appears in the histories as a supporting character, the loyal companion, the grieving beloved, the competent but arrogant general. We do not get his interiority. We do not know what he wanted, what he feared, what he hoped for when the conquest finally ended and the empire settled into something stable. Did he want to go home to Macedon? Did he see himself as part of the new Greco-Persian ruling class Alexander was trying to create? Did he ever resent the position he was in, perpetually second, perpetually defined by his relationship to Alexander rather than by his own achievements? The sources do not ask. They barely seem to notice that the question exists, but we can guess. 16 years is a long time to spend at someone's side. 16 years of war, of constant movement, of sleeping in tents and eating rations, and watching men die, and making decisions that determined whether cities stood or burned. 16 years of being the person Alexander turned to when he needed advice, when he needed reassurance, when he needed someone to tell him he was not losing his mind. That closeness would have been exhausting. It would have been exhilarating. It would have been both at once, all the time, with no break and no privacy and no escape. Hephaestion could not quit. He could not take a leave of absence. He could not step back and let someone else carry the weight for a while. He was in it, totally, for as long as Alexander was alive, and then he was not. Let us talk about the fever. The sources describe it as sudden, which suggests an infection rather than a chronic condition. Fevers in the ancient world could come from anywhere: contaminated water, spoiled food, insect bites, wounds that had not healed properly. Ecbatana was in the mountains, cooler than Babylon, but still a city with all the sanitation problems that cities had in the 4th century BCE. Hephaestion had been participating in athletic games, which meant physical exertion, which meant he was pushing his body hard at a time when any underlying weakness would have been exposed. The physician, Glaucias, tried the standard treatments of the era. Bloodletting was common, based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of humours, and that draining some blood would restore equilibrium. It did not work. Purgatives, drugs meant to induce vomiting or diarrhea, were another go-to treatment, again based on the idea that illness was something that could be expelled from the body. Those did not work either. Rest and diet changes were the fallback. Hephaestion was told not to eat, or to eat only specific things. The sources are unclear. He disobeyed. He ate a roasted chicken and drank wine. And then he died. Was the chicken what killed him? Probably not directly. But if he had a high fever and his body was already struggling, adding a heavy meal and alcohol would have put additional strain on a system that was failing. The fever spiked, his organs shut down. By the time Alexander came back, there was nothing anyone could do. The sources treat Hephaestion's disobedience as a tragic mistake, a moment of weakness that cost him his life. But it also sounds like a choice. He had been sick for a week. He was exhausted, in pain, confined to a bed with nothing to do but lie there and feel his body fail. Maybe he wanted one normal thing, one moment of pleasure, one meal that tasted like life instead of medicine. Maybe he knew he was dying and decided he would rather go out on his own terms than spend another week slowly fading under a physician's care. We do not know. The sources do not give us that level of detail. But the choice is there, in the gap between the doctor's orders and what Hephaestion actually did. Alexander's grief, as we have said, was total. But let us sit with it for a moment longer, because the sources give us details that are easy to skip over if you are reading for the broader historical arc. He lay on the body for hours, not minutes, hours. Long enough that his generals began to worry that he would make himself sick, that he would stop eating or drinking, that the grief would kill him too. When they finally convinced him to get up, he locked himself in his room and refused to see anyone for 3 days. 3 days of silence, no orders given, no meetings held. The empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen, sat leaderless because the man at the center of it could not function. When he emerged, he did not go back to normal. He executed the physician. He ordered cities to tear down their fortifications. He sent messengers to Egypt to ask a god whether Hephaestion should be worshipped. These are not the actions of a man who has processed his grief in a healthy way. These are the actions of someone who has broken and is trying to hold the pieces together with rage and grand gestures and the sheer force of will that had carried him across Asia. The historian Arrian, writing much later, preserves a detail that most histories skip. After Hephaestion died, Alexander ordered that no flutes be played in the camp. Flutes were a standard part of Macedonian military and religious life. They accompanied sacrifices, marches, celebrations. Banning them was not just a gesture of mourning, it was a disruption of the normal rhythms of the army's life, a way of forcing everyone to feel the absence, to live in a world that was wrong because Hephaestion was not in it. The ban stayed in place until Alexander died. 8 months of silence where there should have been music. The sources do not tell us how the soldiers felt about this. Probably they resented it. Probably some of them ignored the order when they were far enough from headquarters that no one would notice. But the order itself tells you something about how Alexander was thinking. He wanted the world to stop. And for a while, because he was Alexander, it did. The funeral itself, when it finally happened in Babylon, was a spectacle that the ancient world remembered for centuries. Diodorus Siculus, writing 300 years later, devotes several pages to describing the pyre in detail. The base was a square, each side roughly 200 feet long, built of palm logs and covered with ornamental decorations. The first tier had golden prows of warships projecting from each side, 240 in total, each one decorated with armor and captured weapons. The second tier had torches held by golden eagles. The third tier showed a hunting scene, animals being chased by hunters, all carved and gilded. The fourth tier showed centaurs in battle. The fifth tier showed lions and bulls in gold, alternating around the perimeter. At the very top, a circular colonnade supported a pavilion where Hephaestion's body lay, surrounded by purple fabric and more gold ornamentation. The whole structure, when completed, was covered in gold leaf and precious fabrics. The cost, as we have said, was 10,000 talents. To put that in perspective again, the Parthenon in Athens, one of the most expensive building projects of the classical Greek world, cost roughly 700 talents. The entire Athenian navy, at the height of its power, 300 warships, cost roughly 6,000 talents to build. Alexander spent 10,000 talents on a funeral pyre that would burn for 3 days and then be gone. The sources, even the ones sympathetic to Alexander, express bewilderment. Arrian calls it excessive. Plutarch calls it evidence of Alexander's unbalanced state of mind. Diodorus simply describes it and lets the reader draw their own conclusions. Modern historians have argued that the pyre was a political statement, a way of demonstrating the wealth and power of the empire, a message to the embassies gathering in Babylon that Alexander could afford to burn a fortune and not even notice. Maybe. But it also sounds like grief, like the kind of irrational, overwhelming need to do something, anything, that might make the loss feel less unbearable. If the pyre was big enough, grand enough, expensive enough, maybe it would match the size of what Alexander had lost. It could not. But he tried. The games that accompanied the funeral brought in 3,000 performers. Athletes, musicians, actors, all competing for prizes funded by Alexander. The sources describe competitions in tragedy, comedy, music, athletics, everything the Greek world valued as markers of culture and civilization. It was meant to honor Hephaestion, to celebrate his memory, to give him a send-off worthy of a hero. But it was also a distraction, a way of filling the days with noise and spectacle, so Alexander did not have to sit alone with the silence. The games lasted for weeks, and when they were finally over, when the pyre had burned and the ashes had been collected and the performers had gone home, Alexander was still alone. Hephaestion was still dead, and nothing Alexander did could change that. The campaign against the Cossayans, the mountain tribe that Alexander slaughtered in Hephaestion's name, is one of the strangest episodes of his reign. The Cossayans were not a threat. They were not wealthy. They did not control strategic territory. They were just there, in the mountains north of Ecbatana, raiding the occasional caravan and living their lives. Alexander took his army into their territory and spent weeks hunting them down, systematically destroying every village, killing every man of fighting age, enslaving everyone else. The sources describe it as a sacrifice, a way of offering Hephaestion's ghost the blood of an entire people. Human sacrifice was not a Macedonian custom. It was not a Greek custom, at least not in the classical period. But Alexander did it anyway, because nothing else felt big enough, because a few oxen and some wine poured on an altar were not adequate to the size of what he had lost. The parallels to Achilles are impossible to miss. When Patroclus died, Achilles sacrificed 12 Trojan captives on his funeral pyre. The Iliad treats this as excessive, even by the standards of a warrior culture that accepted violence as normal. Achilles is described as acting in a kind of madness, a grief so overwhelming that it overrides every other consideration. Alexander was doing the same thing, but on a larger scale, because he had an empire's worth of resources to throw at his grief. The Cossæans were not Trojan captives. They were an entire people, and Alexander wiped them out because Hephaestion was dead, and someone had to pay for it. The sources, writing centuries later, express discomfort with this. They do not quite condemn it, because condemning Alexander too harshly would undermine the entire heroic narrative they are trying to construct. But they note it. They let the reader know that this was not normal, that even by the standards of ancient warfare this was brutal and pointless, and driven by something other than strategic calculation. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, he was exhausted. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, the sources describe him as thinner, paler, quicker to anger. He drank more, he slept less. He made decisions that his advisors thought were reckless or impossible. The plan to invade Arabia, for instance. Arabia was vast, mostly desert, inhabited by tribes that the Persians had never successfully controlled. Alexander wanted to circumnavigate the peninsula, to map the coastline, to establish trade routes that would connect Egypt and Mesopotamia and India into a single economic zone. It was an ambitious plan. It might even have worked if he had lived long enough to carry it out. But the generals did not believe he would. They thought he was chasing another distraction, another way to avoid sitting still and facing the fact that Hephaestion was gone. The embassies arriving in Babylon that summer found a man who looked like Alexander but did not quite act like him. He was polite. He listened. He issued decrees and made treaties and accepted oaths of loyalty. But there was a distance, a sense that he was going through the motions, that the part of him that had cared about building something permanent had died with Hephaestion. The edict recalling the Greek exiles was issued during this period. So was the demand that the Greek cities worship him as a god. Both were politically tone-deaf, the kind of overreach that the younger Alexander would have avoided. But the younger Alexander had not spent 8 months living with a grief that nothing could touch. When Alexander fell ill at Medius's dinner party, the fever came on fast. Within hours, he was shivering and sweating. Within a day, he could not stand. The sources preserve a detailed account of the progression, day by day, symptom by symptom, because the court secretaries kept records, and those records survived long enough for later historians to copy them. Day 1, fever and chills. Day 2, fever higher, severe thirst. Day 3, fever chishu, difficulty speaking. Day 4, delirium, unable to recognize people. Day 5, convulsions. Day 6, brief clarity, able to give a few orders. Day 7, unconscious. Day 8 or 9, depending on which source you trust, respiratory failure. Death. Modern medical analysis of those symptoms suggests several possibilities. Malaria, which was endemic in Mesopotamia and fits the fever pattern. Typhoid, which also fits and was common in cities with poor water sanitation. Acute pancreatitis, possibly triggered by years of heavy drinking. Liver failure, same cause. West Nile virus, which was present in the region and causes the kind of rapid neurological decline the sources describe. Poisoning is harder to assess. The symptoms do not match most known ancient poisons, which tended to act faster and more violently. But there were slower poisons, plant-based toxins that could mimic natural illness, and there were certainly people who wanted Alexander dead. The Macedonian commanders, who resented his transformation into a Persian-style king. The Greek cities that feared his megalomania. The Persian nobles who had lost everything when he invaded. Any of them could have found someone willing to slip something into his wine. The conspiracy theories started almost immediately. Within hours of Alexander's death, people were whispering. Antipater, the Macedonian regent Alexander had left behind in Greece, had sent his son Cassander to Babylon a few months earlier, and Cassander hated Alexander with a quiet, patient intensity that everyone at court recognized. Cassander had watched Alexander execute men for disloyalty, had watched the king adopt Persian customs and marginalize the old Macedonian guard, had watched his own father fall out of favor as Alexander's paranoia grew. The theory went that Cassander had brought poison with him, something slow-acting that would mimic a natural illness, and had slipped it into Alexander's wine at Medius's party. Medius himself was implicated in some versions of the story, accused of being the one who actually administered the poison on Cassander's orders. The fact that Medius was never punished, never even investigated, made people suspicious. But it also made sense. By the time anyone thought to investigate, the empire was collapsing, and no one cared about solving a murder when they were too busy fighting over the throne. Other theories pointed to Aristotle. The philosopher had never forgiven Alexander for the death of Callisthenes, his nephew, who had been arrested and died in custody during the Pages conspiracy years earlier. Aristotle had connections throughout the Greek world, access to rare plants and compounds, knowledge of toxicology that went far beyond what most people understood. The story went that Aristotle had prepared the poison and sent it to Babylon with someone he trusted, possibly even Cassander, who had studied under him. The poison was supposedly derived from a plant that grew only in the coldest regions, something that had to be transported in a container made from a mule's hoof because it would corrode any other vessel. The details are so specific that they sound invented, and they probably were, but the story circulated for centuries. Plutarch mentions it and dismisses it as unlikely. That he mentions it at all tells you how persistent the rumors were. Modern historians tend to think Alexander died of natural causes. The symptom progression fits known diseases. The setting, Babylon in early summer, hot and swampy and full of mosquitoes, was a perfect breeding ground for malaria and other fevers. Alexander had been drinking heavily for months, which would have weakened his liver and made him more vulnerable to infection. He had been under enormous stress, physically and emotionally, since Hephaestion's death. His immune system was probably compromised. A fever that a healthy man might have survived could easily have killed someone in Alexander's condition. The theory is plausible. It is probably correct. But it is also less interesting than poison, which is why the poison theories have never entirely gone away. What we know for certain is that Alexander died, and in his final hours he asked for Hephaestion. The sources are consistent on this. Plutarch says it. Arrian implies it. Even the more hostile accounts, the ones written by historians who thought Alexander had become a tyrant, mention the deathbed request for the man who had been dead for 8 months. It is one of the most human moments in all the Alexander sources. The moment when the king who had conquered the known world, who had declared himself a god, who had spent his entire adult life projecting invincibility, broke down and admitted that there was something he wanted and could not have. He wanted Hephaestion. He wanted the person who had made sense of everything, who had been there since the beginning, who knew him in a way that no one else did or ever would. And Hephaestion was not there, could not be there, would never be there again. The generals standing around Alexander's deathbed did not know what to do with that. They were practical men, soldiers and administrators who dealt in logistics and strategy and power. They understood grief in the abstract, understood that people mourned the dead, but they did not understand this, the intensity of it, the way it had consumed Alexander, the way it was still consuming him even as he lay dying. Some of them probably thought it was weakness. Some of them probably thought it was madness. Some of them, maybe, understood that they were watching something they had no language for, a bond that went deeper than anything their world had words to describe. When Alexander finally lost the ability to speak, his generals asked him who should inherit the empire. The sources preserve several versions of his answer. Some say he whispered, "to the strongest," kratisto in Greek, which would mean the empire would go to whoever could take it and hold it. Some say he whispered, "To the best, Aristo," which would mean the same thing but with a slightly different connotation. Some say he handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his senior commanders, which would suggest he wanted Perdiccas to act as regent until a proper heir could be established. Some say he was already too far gone to answer, that the question was asked, but no response came. The uncertainty is telling. If Alexander had given a clear answer, the sources would agree. The fact that they do not suggest that whatever he said, if he said anything, was ambiguous enough that people heard what they wanted to hear. Roxana, Alexander's wife, was 8 months pregnant when he died. If the child was a boy, he would be the legitimate heir. But the child had not been born yet, and even if he was born healthy, he would be an infant, which meant someone else would have to rule as regent until the boy came of age, and that someone would effectively be king because regents who held power for 15 or 20 years rarely gave it up willingly. The generals knew this. They also knew that Alexander's half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, was still alive. Aridaeus was the son of Philip II by a different mother, which made him Alexander's senior in age, but he was mentally disabled in some way. The sources do not specify clearly. He could not rule on his own, but he could be a figurehead, a king in name, while someone else made the actual decisions. The generals debated. Some wanted to wait for Roxana's child. Some wanted to crown Aridaeus immediately. Some thought the whole idea of a hereditary monarchy was obsolete, that the empire should be divided among the senior commanders and each should rule his own region. None of them trusted each other. All of them knew that the moment they left the room, the knives would come out. The infantry had their own opinion. The Macedonian phalanx, the common soldiers who had followed Alexander from Greece to India and back, wanted a Macedonian king from the royal bloodline. They did not care if Aridaeus was disabled. He was Philip's son. That made him legitimate. The cavalry, the companions who had ridden with Alexander and were mostly drawn from the Macedonian nobility, were more divided. Some supported Perdiccas, some supported other candidates. The two groups nearly went to war with each other in the streets of Babylon before a compromise was reached. Aridaeus would be crowned king, taking the name Philip III. If Roxana's child was a boy, he would be co-king. Perdiccas would serve as regent for both. The empire would be divided into satrapies, and each of the senior generals would govern a region. It was a fragile arrangement, held together by the fact that no one was quite ready to start killing each other yet. It lasted about 2 years. Roxana gave birth to a boy a few months after Alexander died. He was named Alexander IV. He was crowned co-king with Philip III in a ceremony that everyone knew was a fiction. A disabled man and an infant, neither capable of ruling, both serving as masks for the ambitions of the men who claimed to speak in their names. Roxana did what she could to protect her son. She was smart, ruthless, and willing to kill anyone she saw as a threat. But she was also a woman in a world that did not give women power except through their sons, and her son was a baby. The odds were never in her favour. The wars of the successors, the Diadochi, began almost immediately. Perdiccas tried to hold the empire together and was assassinated by his own officers in 321 BCE. Antipater, the old Macedonian regent, took over briefly and died of natural causes in 319 BCE. His son Cassander, the same Cassander rumoured to have poisoned Alexander, seized control of Macedon and spent the next decade fighting off rivals. Ptolemy secured Egypt and made it clear he had no intention of sharing. Seleucus took Babylon and the eastern provinces and built what would become the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus, one of the older generals, tried to reunite the whole empire and came close before being killed in battle in 301 BCE. Lysimachus took Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. The wars dragged on for 40 years, a grinding series of battles and betrayals and shifting alliances that slowly tore apart everything Alexander had built. Philip III Aridaeus was murdered in 317 BCE, probably on Olympias's orders. Alexander's mother had returned to Macedon after her son's death and was trying to secure power for her grandson, Alexander IV. Killing the co-king was a logical step, if logic is the word for dynastic murder. It did not help. Olympias herself was killed the following year by Cassander, who had her stoned to death by the families of men she had executed. Roxana and Alexander IV were imprisoned by Cassander and held under house arrest for years. In 310 BCE, when Alexander IV was 13 years old and theoretically old enough to start asserting his own claim to the throne, Cassander had both him and Roxana quietly murdered. The bodies were hidden. No public funeral, no announcement. The last living descendants of Alexander the Great simply disappeared, and the wars continued without them. By 300 BCE, the generals had stopped pretending they were governing on behalf of a legitimate king. They declared themselves kings of their respective territories and began building dynasties. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon, smaller kingdoms in Asia Minor and Greece. The empire Alexander had built was gone, fractured into pieces that would spend the next 2 centuries fighting each other until Rome came in and conquered them all. The dream of a unified Greco-Persian world, of a kingdom that transcended ethnic boundaries and created something new, died with Alexander. Or maybe it died with Hephaestion. Maybe the only person who could have held it together was the person who understood what Alexander was trying to do, and when he was gone, the whole project became impossible. Hephaestion's tomb in Babylon was never finished. The sources mention it in passing as something Alexander had ordered but did not live to complete. After Alexander died, no one cared enough to finish it. The generals were too busy fighting over the empire. The workers were probably not paid and went home. The structure, whatever had been built, was abandoned. Centuries later, travelers to Babylon mentioned seeing ruins that might have been the tomb's foundation, but they were not sure. The site was eventually lost, buried under centuries of sediment and construction, and the slow decay of a city that was no longer politically important. Modern archaeologists working in Iraq have not found it. They probably never will. Babylon is a massive site, most of it still unexcavated, and a tomb that was never finished and never used would not have left much of a mark. The ashes themselves, the golden urn that Alexander had placed Hephaestion's remains in after the pyre burned, disappeared. They might have been looted during the chaos after Alexander's death. They might have been buried somewhere and the location forgotten. They might have been destroyed deliberately by someone who thought the whole cult of Hephaestion's memory was excessive and wanted to erase it. We do not know. What we know is that no trace of them has ever been found. Hephaestion, who had been honored with a funeral that cost 10,000 talents, who had been proclaimed a hero by the oracle of Ammon, who had been loved by the most powerful man on earth, left no physical remains that survived into the modern era. He exists only in the texts, in the scattered references that ancient historians made, because they could not tell Alexander's story without mentioning the man who had been beside him for 16 years. And those references, sparse as they are, tell us something. They tell us that the ancient world noticed, that the bond between Alexander and Hephaestion was significant enough, visible enough, that historians writing centuries later felt compelled to mention it. That even in a world where same-sex relationships were common, where the Greek gymnasium and the symposium and the military barracks were all sites of male intimacy, this particular relationship stood out. Not because it was sexual, though it may have been. Not because it was romantic, though it probably was. But because it was central. Because Hephaestion mattered to Alexander in a way that shaped the course of history, in a way that meant when Hephaestion died, the empire began to unravel. Let us talk about the later tradition, how the story of Alexander and Hephaestion was remembered, retold, reinterpreted across 2,000 years of art and literature and history. The immediate post-Alexander sources, Ptolemy, Aristobulus, Nearchus, all men who had known Alexander personally and wrote memoirs or histories now lost but used by later writers, seem to have treated Hephaestion as important but not extraordinary. He was one of the companions, a capable general, the man Alexander loved most. They recorded his death and Alexander's grief because both were significant events, but they did not dwell on them. The relationship was a fact, not a mystery. But as time passed, and the eyewitnesses died, and the accounts became second-hand, third-hand, filtered through the biases and concerns of later eras, the story began to shift. Arrian, writing in the 2nd century CE, treats Hephaestion with respect. He mentions the parallel with Achilles and Patroclus explicitly. He describes Alexander's grief as understandable, even noble. He does not use sexual language, but he does not shy away from the intimacy either. Plutarch, writing around the same time, is more ambivalent. He admires Alexander, but also criticizes him. And part of that criticism involves the suggestion that Alexander's emotions were too strong, too uncontrolled, that a truly great man would have mastered his grief instead of letting it consume him. The relationship with Hephaestion becomes evidence of Alexander's passionate nature, which Plutarch sees as both a strength and a weakness. Curtius Rufus, writing in the 1st century CE, gives us more details about the relationship than most sources, but he also moralizes. He describes Hephaestion as Alexander's favorite, dearest above all others, but he frames it as a potential liability, a blind spot that enemies could exploit. He tells the story of the Persian queen mother mistaking Hephaestion for Alexander and uses it to illustrate Alexander's generosity, but he also implies that the favoritism was excessive, that it created resentment among the other commanders. Curtius is writing for a Roman audience that valued stoicism and self-control, and to that audience, Alexander's inability to function after Hephaestion's death would have looked like weakness. By the medieval period, the story had changed further. The Alexander Romance, a wildly popular fictionalized account of Alexander's life that circulated in dozens of languages across Europe, Asia, and Africa, barely mentions Hephaestion. The romance focuses on Alexander's adventures, his battles with monsters and kings and mythical creatures, his quest to reach the ends of the earth. The emotional core of the original story, the relationships, the grief, the human moments, is mostly stripped away. Alexander becomes a heroic archetype, and archetypes do not have complicated emotional bonds that defy easy categorization. Hephaestion appears in some versions as a loyal companion, nothing more. In other versions, he does not appear at all. Renaissance scholars, reading the Greek and Roman sources and trying to reconstruct the historical Alexander, noticed Hephaestion again. They had the texts that mentioned him. They had the parallels with Achilles and Patroclus. But they were writing in a Christian Europe that had very specific ideas about appropriate male friendship and very hostile ideas about sodomy. So they performed a kind of interpretive gymnastics. They acknowledged that Alexander and Hephaestion were extremely close. They praised the friendship as an example of classical virtue, and they insisted, loudly and repeatedly, that there was nothing sexual about it, that the bond was purely spiritual, that anyone who suggested otherwise was slandering the memory of a great king. This interpretation became standard for centuries. You can see it in the biographies, the histories, the artistic depictions. Alexander and Hephaestion are always together, always devoted, but always chaste. Friendship elevated to its highest form, untainted by base desire. The 19th century complicated this. Classical scholars working with better texts and more rigorous methods started to notice that the Greek and Roman sources did not actually insist on chastity the way the Renaissance interpreters had. They started to point out that the parallel with Achilles and Patroclus was deliberate, and that the Greeks themselves had debated whether Achilles and Patroclus were lovers. They started to ask whether the intensity of Alexander's grief might indicate something more than friendship. Some of them were willing to say it outright. Others danced around it, using euphemisms like passionate attachment or romantic friendship that allowed readers to draw their own conclusions. The 20th century brought the question fully into the open. Historians working on ancient sexuality, scholars like Kenneth Dover, whose work on Greek homosexuality became foundational, and later scholars building on his research, made it clear that the ancient world did not divide relationships into heterosexual and homosexual the way modern Western culture does. They pointed out that for elite Greek and Macedonian men, sexual and romantic relationships with other men were normal, expected, even celebrated in certain contexts. The question was not whether such relationships existed, but how they were structured, what they meant socially, how they intersected with marriage and family and political life. In that context, asking whether Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers becomes less a question of proving sexual contact and more a question of understanding what kind of bond they had and what it meant in their world. Some scholars argued that the relationship clearly was sexual, that the intimacy described in the sources, the exclusivity, the jealousy, the depth of grief all point to an erotic bond. They pointed to the cultural context, the Greek celebration of male love, the Theban sacred band, the tradition of pederastia, the literary models Alexander himself drew on. They pointed to the fact that Alexander and Hephaestion travelled together, slept in the same tent, shared their lives in a way that went far beyond what commanding officers normally did. They pointed to the wreath-laying at Troy, the public claim to the Achilles and Patroclus parallel, which in the Greek cultural context would have been understood as a declaration. If you say, "I am Achilles and he is Patroclus," you are saying something specific about the nature of your bond, and everyone listening knows what you mean. Other scholars pushed back. They argued that the sources never explicitly say the relationship was sexual, that Greek and Roman historians had vocabulary for sexual relationships and chose not to use it here, that the bond could have been intensely emotional without being physical. They pointed out that Alexander's sexual relationships with women are documented, Roxana, Statera, possibly others, and that there is no equivalent documentation of sexual relationships with men, including Hephaestion. They argued that projecting modern categories onto ancient relationships is anachronistic, that we cannot assume a relationship was sexual just because it was emotionally intense, that friendship in the ancient world could be deeper and more central than modern readers expect, without crossing into the erotic. Both arguments have merit. Both are probably missing something, because the question itself, were they or were they not lovers, assumes that lovers is a clear category with fixed boundaries, and it is not. Not in the ancient world, and not now. A relationship can be emotionally primary without being sexually active. A relationship can be sexually active without being emotionally primary. A relationship can be romantic in the sense of being centered on deep affection and exclusivity without involving sex. A relationship can involve sex without being romantic. The Greeks had words for all these variations: eros, philia, storge, agape, and none of them map cleanly onto English words like love or friendship or romance. Asking whether Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers forces their bond into a binary that the sources refuse to provide and that the cultural context did not recognize. What we can say with confidence is this: Alexander loved Hephaestion. The sources all agree. The nature of that love, whether it included physical intimacy, whether it was exclusive or one bond among many, whether it fits the definition of romantic love or something else, is not something the sources tell us clearly enough to settle. What they tell us is that Hephaestion was the most important person in Alexander's life for 16 years, that Alexander trusted him above everyone, that when Hephaestion died, Alexander's ability to function collapsed, that the grief was so total and so visible that historians writing centuries later still thought it worth recording. And that matters. It matters because for most of history, relationships like that were erased. Historians wrote them out, redefined them as simple friendship, insisted that the intensity was admiration or loyalty or anything other than love. The Victorian biographers who swore that Alexander and Hephaestion were chaste were not operating in good faith. They were protecting their own cultural assumptions, defending a version of masculinity that could not accommodate the possibility that the greatest conqueror in history might have loved another man in a way that transcended categories. By insisting on chastity, they made the relationship safe. They made it something that could be admired without threatening the boundaries of acceptable male behavior. But in doing so, they erased what made it extraordinary. They turned a bond that defied the world's expectations into something ordinary, legible, containable. The 21st century has begun to reverse that. Scholars working in queer history, particularly those studying the ancient world, have argued that we should take the sources seriously when they describe relationships that do not fit easily into boxes. That when Plutarch says Hephaestion was Alexander's other self, we should sit with that language instead of immediately translating it into something more familiar. That when Arrian describes Alexander laying a wreath on Achilles' tomb and Hephaestion laying one on Patroclus's, we should recognize that as a public declaration of a bond modelled on the most famous love story in Greek literature. That when the sources describe Alexander's grief as excessive, uncontrolled, total, we should ask what it means that a man who conquered the known world could not conquer the absence of one person. Modern retellings of the Alexander story have started to include Hephaestion as more than a footnote. Novels, films, television series, some treat the relationship as explicitly romantic, some leave it ambiguous, some focus on the emotional bond without specifying its nature. The 2004 film Alexander, directed by Oliver Stone, depicts Hephaestion as Alexander's primary love interest, a relationship that is both romantic and sexual. The film was controversial, criticized for historical inaccuracies, and for what some viewers saw as an overemphasis on Alexander's sexuality. But it also brought the relationship into popular consciousness in a way that academic histories never could. People who had never heard of Hephaestion learned his name, learned that Alexander's story included a love that lasted 16 years and ended with a grief that shook an empire. The novelist Mary Renaud, writing in the mid-20th century, gave us the most nuanced fictional portrayal of Alexander and Hephaestion in her trilogy The Persian Boy, Fire from Heaven, and Funeral Games. Renaud was a lesbian, writing at a time when depicting queer relationships openly was risky, and she brought a deep understanding of both ancient history and the experience of loving outside social norms. Her Alexander and Hephaestion are lovers, but the relationship is complex, affectionate and possessive, supportive and competitive, built on years of shared history and a bond that neither of them fully understands. Renaud does not shy away from the difficulties. She shows the jealousy, the tension with other commanders, the way Hephaestion's position creates resentment. She also shows the tenderness, the quiet moments, the unspoken understanding that comes from knowing someone since you were both boys. Her version is fiction, but it feels truer to the sources than many academic histories because she is willing to sit with ambiguity instead of resolving it. For queer readers, Alexander and Hephaestion matter in a specific way. They are one of the few historical examples of a same-sex bond that was central to world history, documented in multiple sources, and impossible to erase entirely, no matter how hard later generations tried. The relationship survived 2,000 years of historians who wanted to minimize it, moralists who wanted to deny it, and biographers who wanted to explain it away. It survived because the sources were too clear, the bond too visible, the consequences too significant. You cannot tell the story of Alexander without Hephaestion. You can downplay him, you can refuse to call the relationship what it was, but you cannot remove him without leaving a hole that everyone notices. And that means something. It means that in the ancient world, at the highest levels of power, a love between two men could be real and recognized and central. It means that Alexander, who could have chosen anyone, who had access to wealth and women and every form of influence, chose to spend his life beside a man he had known since adolescence. It means that when that man died, the grief was public, monumental, a spectacle that the entire empire witnessed. It was not hidden. It was not shameful. It was not reduced to euphemism. It was love, whatever form that love took, and it mattered enough to reshape history. That is what gets lost when we insist on categorizing the relationship, on deciding whether it was sexual or romantic or just friendship. The point is not what label we apply. The point is that it was real, that it was central, that it refused to fit neatly into the roles the world offered. Alexander was supposed to marry for alliance, produce heirs, maintain appropriate distance from his subordinates. Hephaestion was supposed to serve loyally, accept his place in the hierarchy, not expect a level of intimacy that made other commanders uncomfortable. They did none of that. They built something that existed outside the normal structures of power and family and obligation, something that was theirs alone, and they refused to apologize for it. That refusal is what makes the story queer, even if we never know for certain whether they were lovers in the physical sense. Queer is not just about who you sleep with. It is about refusing the categories, living in the spaces the world does not have names for, building bonds that do not ask permission. The story ends in Babylon, in a palace bedroom, with a man dying of fever and asking for someone who cannot come. It ends with ashes in a golden urn and a tomb that was never finished. It ends with an empire collapsing because the only two people who understood what it was supposed to be were gone. That is tragedy. That is also love. The kind of love that does not survive the people who carry it. The kind that cannot be transferred or replicated or handed down to the next generation. When Alexander died, the dream died with him. Not the dream of empire. His generals kept that going for decades, carving up the territory and building dynasties. But the dream of something larger, something that transcended borders and bloodlines and the old ethnic divisions. That dream required both of them. Required the partnership, the shared vision, the bond that let them imagine a world that did not exist yet. When Hephaestion died, half of that dream was gone. When Alexander died 8 months later, the rest went with him. We are left with fragments, scattered references in histories written centuries after the fact, tomb inscriptions that may or may not refer to the right people, archaeological sites that might be the cities they founded or might be something else entirely. The golden urn is gone. The pyre is ash. The bodies are dust. What survives is the story. The fact that two men loved each other in a way that an empire could not contain, and that 2,000 years later, we are still trying to find the words to describe what that meant. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting whenever you are ready. If this one stayed with you, the like button helps others find it too. But there is no rush. You have nowhere to be right now except here, in the quiet, in the dark, thinking about two boys who met in a classroom in northern Greece and spent the next 16 years remaking the world. What would it have been like, do you think, to be Hephaestion? To grow up beside someone who would become the most famous person in history, to watch him transform from a student reading the Iliad by lamplight into a king who controlled half the known world, to be the person he turned to when the weight of it became too much, the person who saw him scared and drunk and grieving and still chose to stay, to know that you mattered to him in a way that no title or position could capture, and also to know that the world would never quite understand, would always reduce you to loyal companion or ambitious favourite or some other phrase that missed the point entirely. What would it have been like to be Alexander in those last 8 months after Hephaestion died? To rule an empire and know that the one person who understood why it mattered was gone. To sit in meetings with generals and satraps and diplomats, and feel the absence beside you like a physical wound. To plan campaigns and issue decrees and accept oaths of loyalty, and know that none of it would ever feel real again, because the person you built it with, the person you built it for, was not there to see it. History does not usually give us that level of emotional detail. We get battles and treaties and the rise and fall of empires. We do not get the quiet moments, the private grief, the love that shaped decisions in ways the official records never capture. But sometimes, if you read carefully, if you pay attention to what the sources say and what they do not say, you catch a glimpse. A funeral pyre that cost 10,000 talents. A deathbed request for someone who had been gone for months. A wreath laid on a tomb in a ruined city. A public claim to a bond the world did not have language for. That is what we have. That is what survives. Two men who loved each other across 16 years and 4,000 miles, who built an empire together and lost it together, who were remembered imperfectly but remembered nonetheless. The historians who tried to erase them failed. The moralists who tried to explain them away failed. The centuries of silence and euphemism and insistence that it was just friendship, nothing more, all failed. Because the love was too big, too visible, too central to be hidden. It is still there in the sources, waiting for anyone willing to see it. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, spare a thought for Alexander and Hephaestion. For the boys, they were in Mieza, studying philosophy and dreaming of glory. For the young men, they became at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, riding side by side into battles they should not have won. For the weary veterans, they were in India, pushing their army to the edge of the world because they did not know how to stop. For the grieving king who spent his last months trying to make the world acknowledge a loss it could not measure. For the general who died of a fever in the mountains and left a hole that an empire could not fill. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And for 16 years, in a world that tried to categorize everything, that was enough. May your own loves be as fierce and as true, even if the world never quite finds the words. May you build something together that outlasts you both. And may you rest easy, knowing that some bonds are so strong that 2,000 years of forgetting cannot erase them. Good night, and sleep well.